Hello, it's Stefan Kuchar from BetterRetirementLife.com. Today I'm going to talk about sheltered housing and in particular some of the pros and cons of getting into it. But there are two types of sheltered housing. There's the type that you can rent and there's the type that you can buy. And each of those different types, whether you rent or buy, have their own set of pros and cons. And at the very end, I'm going to give you some information to help you look at leasing and some independent financial advice as well. Let me just summarize first. What are the pros and cons of sheltered housing? Well, the pros include the fact that you can move into a community that's already established. So there's a social network set up there, and then there are support services as well. Some of the cons include the fact that you may not actually like that kind of closed unit and social housing, and you may be involved in having to pay high exit fees if you've bought into that type of leasehold arrangement. So let's first go into describe what is sheltered housing. Sheltered housing, essentially it's housing which is designed particularly for the over 55-year-old person or partners to live in, and it enables you to live independently, but also with that important support network as well. What type of person would be interested in moving into sheltered housing? Well, at the moment, you might be okay in terms of physical and good mental health. But if you know that you've been recently diagnosed with maybe a long-term medical condition, and you know that you're going to get progressively worse over time, then sheltered housing may be suitable for you, in that as your disease progressively gets worse over time, you're going to need progressively more and more care in your home. And sheltered housing could be a really good way for you to receive that care. The first step that you need to do if you think that sheltered housing may be for you. And I would say the first thing to do is to get down to your local authority, to the social care department, and get yourself a care needs assessment. Whether they ultimately provide you with care is another thing. The bar is very high nowadays, particularly across the UK. But what they will do is they'll be able to give you a list of providers that you can access through renting or through buying. What are sheltered housing complexes like? Well, typically they tend to be 1 or 2 bedroom apartments. They tend to be grouped together, maybe 10, 20 or 50 apartments together, and they'll have this social network as well. So some of the things that you might get include maybe bingo nights or coffee mornings. You might have a cinema event within the complex, and maybe there could be a gardening club or an afternoon tea club, maybe, and maybe some very light exercise as well. So there is a range of support services that would be on hand for you, which you might think is advantageous. Let's look at what do we think are the major pluses or advantages of living in sheltered accommodation. Well, one of them is that you are actually able to live independently, but you have a degree of privacy. When you close your front door, that's it. People are not just wandering in and out of your apartment. Secondly, you can pretty much have a retirement place of your choice, particularly if you've purchased. And then, living in a sheltered home gives you a degree of security as well, in that you have less of a home to manage. You might only have 1 or 2 bedrooms, whereas you might be living in a 3 or 4 bedroom house at the moment, and you may think, oh my gosh, what about the gardening? Well, the gardening's all looked after for you when you go into sheltered housing. And then, of course, you've got access, as I mentioned earlier, to all the kind of social and communal activities as well. So so there are some very distinct advantages. So what are some of the disadvantages of living in sheltered accommodation? Well, firstly, if you go through your local authority, the chances are pretty high you're going to be on some sort of waiting list. Those waiting lists could go on months. And obviously that's not such a key thing if you decide to go into the private sector. There may be rules around pets, whether you can have them, how many you can have, and when you can have them looked after, or when you can take them out and about. You may not always get the home that you want if you go through the local authority. And in terms of, as I mentioned earlier, if you have a long-term illness, as your illness gets progressively worse, there may be a kind of a ceiling whereby the amount of care provided by the management company or the local care company will reach a ceiling, and after that you may have to move out. So that is a particular disadvantage, particularly if you wanted to stay there forever. Excuse me. And then finally, if you buy sheltered accommodation, then in a number of cases the exit fees are particularly extortionate, and you might be paying 1, 2, 3% of the sales price that you paid for it, which you will sign up for when you buy that property. And in some cases I've seen exit fees as high as 30%. But that's not the only disadvantage of buying sheltered accommodation. The other thing is that there is quite a limited market, and because the market is limited, it means that prices don't always go up. In fact, over the last few years, certainly prices have been pretty flat, and in some cases they've been decreasing. So if you put a lot of money into sheltered accommodation, it may not always give you the kind of return that you want, particularly if you're going to offer it to your family and children as part of their inheritance. Things that you should think about asking before you move into sheltered accommodation. Well, just how much are you going to be paying every month for your management fees, and what do those fees include? Do they include all the maintenance and the cleaning of the common parts in the flat, or do they include the actual cleaning and maintenance of your own flat as well? Does it include all the gardening charges and all the costs for the social provision as well? So there are a number of different things that you need to bear in mind. So you buy into a sheltered housing scheme, they should provide pretty much a full-time warden on site that should be available to you should you need it, should you need that additional care and support. And it should be registered with the National House Building Association. One of the things you want to look out for if you buy sheltered housing is a clause in your agreement that stipulates that you have to sell through the company that you bought it through the vending company, and that may restrict the market that's available. The other thing to bear in mind is that there are additional fees as well. If you're buying, you'll have to pay ground rent, could be £50 or £100 a year. Plus you're going to have to pay regular monthly service charges. They could be between £100 and £500 each calendar month. And obviously those fees will depend on the amount of services that you're having. Obviously, if you're having more care services, then the higher those costs are going to be. Just reflecting on the fees, there are no vacations. So just because you go on vacation for 1 or 2 weeks, you might go to the Canaries or wherever it is, or go and see your auntie in Yorkshire. you're still going to have to pay your monthly fees. That doesn't go away. And if you go into hospital or you go into some sort of respite care for a while, or your partner does, again, you're going to have to continue to maintain those fees. So there's a lot of things to think about when it comes to sheltered housing. So I've tried to encapsulate a lot of different pros and cons about moving into sheltered housing. Is it for you? Is it suitable for you? Will you thrive there? Will you be happy there? There's a whole lot of different factors to bear in mind. The other thing I would say to you finally is that there is some free independent legal advice and independent financial advice available. And for details of that, I suggest you go over to betterretirementlife.com, over to the website, and I'll put up an abbreviated web address that you can cut and paste and check it out. Okay, thanks for listening, and I wish you all the best with your decision to move into sheltered housing.